Okay, good morning, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. It's such an honor to be here and to have been asked to speak at this conference, in spite of the fact that I couldn't actually be there. I really miss everybody quite a lot, being in the United States. I've walked side by side with so many of you as I thought about and wrote about settler colonialism and racism and white supremacy. So for me, it's always been an incredibly collective conversation, and I'm really very sorry not to be in person and also to have missed all the people that I have walked alongside. Hi to Sunera and to Mona Kawa and Sherene Kassam and all of the people who I have walked with on this journey. So I'm very grateful to be able to introduce my new book, which I hope you will read. The book is called Nothing Has to Make Sense, Upholding Anti-Muslim Racism, Upholding White Supremacy Through Anti-Muslim Racism. So as the subtitle indicates, this is a book about white supremacy and how it is upheld through anti-Muslim racism. So while the book is a continuation of Casting Out, for those who know my previous work, if you read it, you will see that it is actually another installment in my writing about settler colonialism and white supremacy. I pursue that elsewhere, as some of you know, through looking at anti-Indigenous violence and racial terror. I am most concerned with the figure at the heart of the colonial story, the colonizer-settler subject, a gendered subject, to be sure. So this is not a book about Muslims per se, but rather a book about law, whiteness, and white worlds, the worlds that we glimpse when we look through the prism of the Muslim phantoms who inhabit the law. So the book is really an effort to think in a sustained way about 5 interconnected things, in no particular order: Christianity and whiteness, racism as a register that spans extremist and liberal positions, which are interconnected, the relationship between the structure of white supremacy and those subjects for whom hostility towards Muslims is a key part of their racial subjectivity, and anti-Muslim racism, fourth, as a global formation, and I know you've heard about some of that already, and fifth, law. I won't go through all of these themes today. I really don't have enough time to do that. And I hope I've actually laid them out as clearly as I could in the introduction to the book. So I'll refer you to that. But today, in these quick remarks, I would just like to bring together what I learned from the research and how it enables me to think about what is happening right now. Principally in the United States, as we view the hearings about the January 6th insurrection and what happened on January 6th itself when we watched it live on our screens. And of course, for Canadians, the context would be how all of this bleeds into Canada, but also Canada has its own Indigenous responses that mirror these in some way. This is, I hope that the book actually will function to provide a kind of context in which to understand white supremacy as it operates daily, but also in these spectacular moments like insurrections and truckers' protests and things like that. Canadians need to be concerned. I speak as a Canadian here, we've always needed to be concerned about the US context, of course. You live next door to the giant, to the empire. But also, we might think about the resurgence of a right-wing nationalism, a Christian one at that, the intensity of settler colonialism. We might think here of maybe Quebec and its special antipathy to Muslims and indeed to all immigrants. When we think of all of these things, I think we find very easily the figure of the Muslim. So when I watched, the January 6th insurrection in real time, my first reaction was surprise that I actually already knew something about what was happening and I could analyze it. My research into anti-Muslim racism had already introduced me to the cast of characters I was seeing on the screen, and in fact, really specifically to that cast of characters. What anti-Muslim racism can tell us about Christianity, white supremacy, and the US insurrection is something I want to think about here today. And what I suggest, I did this in a little article I did for Canada, so maybe some of you may know it. I suggest that we locate the confluence of God, guns, and country that we saw on that day on a settler colonial and imperial landscape, tracing how a territorial white subject comes to feel and enact racial entitlement and aggrievement through Christianity, an affect that is especially evident when we consider Muslims in the white imaginary. So let me start with the foundations of whiteness. The phrase Christian white supremacy is tautological, given the way that Christianity has long provided emotional content to whiteness. Of course, whereas white supremacy's Christian core anchors settler colonialism in the Americas, racial capitalism of US empire, and European imperialism more broadly, it should be said that African American and Indigenous Christians, a number of other racialized Christians, have adopted Christianity, inherited from a white settler and slave-owning society, into something that provides the basis for their own survival. And here, I could mention the work of scholars on Black evangelicals and so on. Nevertheless, white supremacy remains inextricably tethered to Christianity. The connection between Christianity and whiteness, which I define as the fantasy position of racial superiority that white supremacy requires and reproduces, that fantasy becomes both visible and denaturalized when we focus on the emotions that characterize the contemporary white subject. These emotions tell us a great deal about how a territorial white subject comes to feel both racial entitlement and aggrievement through religion. If, as David Goldberg argues, modern race takes up some of religion's driving terms, then religion provides racial affect. Watching the insurrection unfold on screen, I thought about the emotional worlds of the political actors I encountered in my research on anti-Muslim politics. Some of the same crusader, cross-wearing white supremacist groups, such as the Proud Boys and the Three Percenters, were on the scene in all of the conflicts that I researched and that are discussed in most of the conflicts discussed in this book. This suggests that the religious resonance that whiteness has and the racial resonance that Christianity has combines with a coordinated thrust of white nationalist politics. It suggests that emotions, rather than rationality, are the mechanism that powers white supremacy. This is why the book is called Nothing Has to Make Sense, because when you go into the law expecting to find some kind of logic, what you find instead is an endless parade of Muslim phantoms, and there's no need to look for logic. Instead, all you find are extremely outrageous claims that somehow pass as rational. The claim, for example, that Muslims have a gene for violence. When the New York Times columnist Michelle Goldberg asked a columnist for the New Yorker, Luke Mogelson, what surprised him when he returned to the US in 2020 after covering wars abroad, he answered that what surprised him was how genuinely scared a number of people on the right were. He might have said a number of white people principally. They were scared of Indigenous people, Black people, Muslims, perhaps scared of women who dared to want to control their own body. He concluded that if a large-scale violence were to erupt in the United States, It would be a war that was fueled not by injury, but by delusion. Morgelson even found Proud Boys who were afraid to go into a public park in broad daylight because they feared they would be attacked by Black Lives Matter or Antifa groups whom they regularly conflated. In other words, a satanic pedophile, typically a Muslim, lurked behind every bush. I found such Muslim phantoms all over the law, and it pressed me to think about whether had they always been there, or is this a more contemporary phenomenon? The fear, however, if you want to call it fear, and I have some difficulty with that word, is palpable, and it gives rise to an aggrieved white subject who wants to dispel the fear through violence. So here's an example. In chapter 1 of the book, I examined a number of legal conflicts between school boards and the mostly white Christian parents who rejected any mention of Islam in the school curriculum. For example, enraged that his daughter, a high school senior, had a homework assignment in a world religions course where she was asked to name the 5 pillars of Islam and the content of the Shahada. One parent, John Wood, announced in his words that his white ass is going to school on Monday and letting his feelings be known, employing the term 5.56, which is Army slang for a 5.56 millimeter caliber ammunition. Wood declared to a friend that rather than study Islam, it's best to shoot them fuckers every day. In a lawsuit brought against the school board, Wood explained that his angry response to the homework assignment originated in his own religiosity. As he explained to the judge, his Christian faith got him through the despair that he felt about 9/11, as well as his military service during Operation Desert Storm, when 2 of his comrades were killed. Bearing in mind that court cases are carefully scripted events in which far-right, conservative Christian and Zionist organizations conspire together to frame the narrative of Muslims as wartime and medieval religious enemies, we can discern in Wood's account the way that anti-Muslim sentiment provides him with national identity. It provides him a kind of dwelling place, I think as Sarah Ahmed put it, where his American self, Christian, white, committed to US empire, all can cohere. Believing that his own God was being denied, a sentiment he expressed in court, Wood felt driven to protect his own place in the world from racial intrusion with guns, if necessary. This is the kind of subject that I want to think about first, not the only subject. And it is the kind of subject that we saw on our television screens when the January 6th insurrection occurred. And we see them now when there's an investigation of that insurrection. We also see this subject during mass shootings. Can the protection of whiteness proceed without these racialized phantoms? And very specifically here, a phantom who comes by stealth in the night into the Christian home, hiding in a homework assignment. What kind of person lives in a world peopled with such phantoms? And how is it that this world is one that is always already given to racial violence as a broad principle of modern life? What Wood's reaction reveals is that whiteness is an emotional and material place to dwell, a literal and an emotional home, and a territory that is always imagined to be under siege. It's clearly a militarized condition. In the white imagination, the walls of a home are constituted to keep racialized strangers and threats out. That's how home is understood. These walls are constantly at risk of being breached, both psychically and materially. So war making and homeland security are nothing if not the way of white life. And Wood is the white subject driven to exorcise his demons and to secure his racial religious entitlement through violence and through law. Christianity is territorial when it is connected to whiteness, and it is a tortured condition. We can't understand the US election and the riot that followed without due regard for the settler self, in which whiteness, property, and Christianity are conjoined. A settler subject regenerates through violence, the immortal words of Richard Slotkin, in a process that is really directed at the demons of the settler unconscious, those demons being indigenous and enslaved peoples and all formerly enslaved peoples and all foreigners, in quotation marks, whose lands and bodies have been stolen. So we must ask, as William Pinard does, what is the psychosexual structure and historical character of whiteness that renders it so aggressive, so tortured, and so interested in subjugation? The answer, of course, lies not in whiteness as prejudice, but as an affective condition that is foundational to imperialism and settler colonialism. So the Christian core to whiteness and these territorial attributes were abundantly in evidence during the election, and they burst into full bloom when, upon the defeat of Donald Trump, a largely white mob stormed the Capitol to protest, and are still protesting, what is regarded as a stolen election. So many observers have noted the connections on display between Christianity, whiteness, and the violence. Journalists were quick to say it's not by chance that banners with Jesus's name flew above the week's insurrection on Capitol Hill. Many emphasized the connection to Donald Trump, etc., and noted that Trump exploited white fears until a mass psychosis seems to have taken hold among the Christian right, and specifically among white evangelicals. There's a lot of truth to these explanations that assign a prominent role to white evangelicals, but this restricted lens tends to obscure the whiteness that powers the settler colonial project more broadly. So when we blame evangelicals or the far right or the Proud Boys, white supremacy becomes understood as something only crazy conspiracy-minded Christians espouse and sustain. It's not actually considered to be the basis of the settler colonial project. So, good liberal white Christians are imagined as having nothing to do either with white supremacy or with the insurrection. The aggrieved evangelical Christian becomes the subject, the John Wood become the figure everyone loves to blame. If white innocence is secured through this ideological move to confine racism to white evangelicals, then it's really critical that we move beyond explanations that protect whiteness through distinctions between good whites and bad whites, and correspondingly through distinctions between good Muslims and bad Muslims. So how do we do this? I suggest methodologically that we consider how whites, and those, of course, who are aspiring to be white or racially dominant, ride into personhood on these waves of emotion that coalesce into a politics. We should, in other words, keep the territorial imperative and the affect of white supremacy very firmly in mind. So the emotions that coalesce into this affect and is the basis of anti-Muslim racist politics reveal that the white Christian subject who feels racial hostility towards Muslims is above all a colonizer. May seem obvious, but we have to keep it in mind. Religious feeling nourishes racial entitlement. To the settler of the Americas, as for the European colonizing non-European lands, Christianity and white supremacy are indissolubly linked and foundational to white projects of rule. The theologian Willie Jennings proposes that when Christian identity came to mean that the earth belongs to those who own, develop, and deserve it, and the connection between people and the lands they lived on was severed, imperialism and Christianity reinforced each other. It was as Christians that whites consolidated the racial order that is the basis of settler colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade, seeking divine sanction for both. And it was as a superior Christian civilization that Europeans acted out their colonial impulses, both in the Old World and the New. Scholars who work with concepts of colonialism, imperialism, and white supremacy, as I'm doing here, emphasize the territorial imperative that is at the heart of whiteness, but in all its manifestations, both religious and secular, left and right, liberal and conservative, New World and Old. Whites ride into personhood as a superior race on a wave of Christian feeling. In the book, I draw on W.E. Du Bois and others to elaborate this ride into personhood as an embodied condition that is transnational. As Du Bois put it, whiteness is the ownership of the earth forever and ever. And as an embodied condition, whiteness is characterized by a great mass of hatred. He described hatred towards Black people, and he linked these emotions to projects of imperial expansion. I'm quite worried about how hatred gets featured in this discourse, but I do want to emphasize that I agree with Du Bois that we have to think about these emotions as fueling imperial expansion. Of course, Du Bois wasn't so perceptive about Muslims, but that's another story. Scholars have remarked upon whiteness as a transnational form of racial identification in the 20th century, when whiteness became the basis of geopolitical alliances. The Muslim as a global enemy is a key contemporary figure at the center of global white politics. Those who track, for example, the shadow of Islam in the constitution of Europeans as European and as white, show that Enlightenment thinkers imagined Islam as Europe's antonym and Europe as the cradle of democracy and secularism only because they could have this Muslim phantom providing the opposite. And of course, these intellectual developments occurred on an imperial field where Muslims, and then Turks and Moors, stood in the way of European capitalist accumulation. Today, with respect to Muslims, whether saving Muslim women from their so-called barbaric cultures or saving the world for democracy, the imperial impulses that drive war-making in Muslim lands derive their force from the conviction that white Christians must inherit the earth, whether to inaugurate the eschatological scenario of the rapture in Palestine, as is the case with evangelical Christians, or to stem the tide of refugees from Muslim lands flowing into Europe, or simply to restore the earth to those who are imagined as most deserving of it. Whiteness, religious feeling, and imperial colonial impulses remain conjoined in all the contemporary conflicts, as is spectacularly demonstrated in the case of the colonization of Palestine and the tensions that produce dispossessed Palestinians who are imagined not as dispossessed, but as Muslim terrorists. If white race-making and territorial projects proceed through religion, the collective emotions that run like a stream through white supremacy form an affect in law in which the Muslim is a phantom, the terrorist, always in quotation marks, the child with violence in his vein, you'll remember Omar Khadr, the duplicitous, cunning, and ungrateful wearers of veils, burqas, and niqabs who all have to be disciplined. All of this animates whiteness as a modern, enlightened, aggrieved, and fearful condition. Describing the work that emotions do in circulating and producing identities, Sarah Ahmed notes that people become invested in particular structures to the extent that their demise is felt as a kind of living death. Ghassan Haj identified some time ago that whites exhibit paranoid forms of belonging. When considering the territorial and symbolic basis of whiteness, however, people are more likely to name religion than they do race. For example, the Christian dimension of the US presidential election is seldom labeled as central to the origin and sustenance of whiteness. Of course, faith-based politics confuses the matter, and we don't easily see how a religious self is premised on racial feeling and how a racial self comes into existence through religious life. It's especially difficult when we consider people who announce themselves, aggressively rather, as secular. Think, for example, of those French and Quebecois feminists who pursue hijab wearers with abandon. Where is their Christianity, you might ask? Is it hiding under a mantle of secularism? How is this position deeply racial rather than, as is presented, feminist? Follow the line that announces European civilization as superior, and you will find all the connections. Anti-Muslim racism really provides for me a kind of methodology of sorts, because Muslims activate white fears in unique ways, and not only because they are the historical enemies of Christendom, but because they are key to the territorial and symbolic basis of whiteness. Gender is, of course, always key to the making of racial states and racial personhood. White women who desire whiteness will need to pursue it through the domination of Muslim women, among others. And both white men and white women desire Muslim women, without whom their superiority could not easily be embodied. So if Muslims have become the universal enemy today, it is surely because the permanent war-making structure of white supremacy means that the lands and resources that Muslims have are critical to empire. The Muslim as a global terrorist is a figure of considerable value. In this, constellation of white fears, you find, hostility, racism towards Black people, immigrants at the border, Muslims, etc. In this constellation of white fears, you see this tortured whiteness that is struggling to emerge through the fog. In all of this, what about the liberals? In the introduction to the book, actually at Carmela Murdoka's suggestion, I revisited an old article, a very good old article by Barna Hess about racial governance, where he argues that when we award racism an ideological exceptionality, we miss its connection to imperialism and to routine racial governance. And so this example enabled me to emphasize that extremist and liberal versions work together. So, I might run the risk of repeating the very move that I'm critiquing if I gave you only the example of John Wood and his far-right Christian animosity. What about the liberal settler subjects and emotions? How is that connected to settler colonialism? Let me sort of end this with a brief consideration of that liberal subject who evinces an apparently secular consciousness, but who is no less committed to Christian white supremacy and empire. Liberal parents in these school battles that I researched often decried their unsophisticated, illiberal opponents. Those guys are primitive, they basically said, not like us. They staked their own claims to whiteness on the premise of multicultural inclusivity. Multicultural inclusivity preserves the centrality of the white subject, and it installs a tolerant, cosmopolitan, urban, quintessentially modern subject as normative. For this liberal subject, Muslims are entitled to a brief mention in the curriculum, and they are tolerated in the school, provided they do not make claims that they are the targets of racism, or relatedly, and far more incendiary, that they are the victims of a settler colonial project, Israel. As we see with the numerous conflicts between Zionists protecting Israel's right to Palestinian land and advocates for Palestinian sovereignty, it is possible to dismiss Muslim human rights on the basis that claims involving Muslims are really the claims of an aggressor and a terrorist group rather than the claims of a targeted and dispossessed peoples. Muslims, or anyone associated or who comes near them, are declared undeserving of equal protection in the law. Scholars and advocates who insist upon the protection of Palestinian human rights have actually found themselves sanctioned and dismissed in courts and in the US, Canadian, European academies. And I know you have tons of examples of this from the Canadian context, from U of T onwards. It is even the case that when Muslims are the targets of mass shootings and massacres, there's a reluctance to explain the violence as racial violence inflicted in the name of white supremacy. As Kada Marous has shown, Muslims who were grieving after a white gunman killed a dozen worshippers at a Quebec City mosque felt compelled to express restraint in denouncing the killer as racist. The connection between racism and the massacre was widely questioned in the media, notwithstanding the shooter's very evident white supremacist connections. In the deadly Canadian attack of June 2021, when a 20-year-old white man intentionally ran down and killed a Muslim family in London, Ontario, Muslims who were interviewed about the murders had to remind Canadians that Islamophobia was real and not the imaginary racism that some have termed it. In the example with which I began, the school conflicts, we see a liberal politics of inclusion coexisting with a more extremist position. When the San Diego Unified School Board of Education proposed measures to address the bullying of Muslim school children, the board began to confront parents very similar to Wood, again, organized by the Proud Boys, Zionist organizations, and Christian conservative ones, who warned them that Muslims were pedophiles affiliated with Hamas and whose children were not in fact being bullied. The school board, rejecting the pressure to eliminate the anti-bullying program altogether and to give in to what many regarded as crazy right-wing nonsense, the school board announced that it would indeed continue the anti-bullying program. But here's the rub. The program would now be spearheaded not by Muslim civil rights groups such as CARE, Canadian Arab Relations, who had earlier been the group advising the board about the bullying. Instead, it would now be spearheaded by the Anti-Defamation League, an organization led by Jews, Zionist Jews in particular. The League takes the position that anyone critical of Israel and expressing support for Palestinian rights is guilty of anti-Semitism. In a similar move, President Biden, heralded by the Christian Science Monitor as one of the most pious Christian leaders for decades, endorses an anti-racist school curriculum, even as his administration has made clear that some criticism of Israel is racist and anti-Semitic. So the charge of anti-Semitism leveled at Muslims and those who advocate for Palestinian rights offers a contemporary example of the limits of multicultural tolerance. Muslims do not merit inclusion as victims of racial or colonial harm. They are only tolerated as faith figures, providing that they do not overreach and are not too Muslim. Liberals, no less than conservatives and their evangelical counterparts, are committed to empire and to white Christian hegemony. The arguments that I make rely on many scholars who came before me and who write very persuasively of race and liberal discourses with respect to Muslims. I'm thinking here of Ratna Kapoor's work, but also Joseph Massad and others. Many anti-colonial and anti-racist thinkers are emphasizing the liberal side of this coin and the damage it does. I think here of Dylan Rodriguez and his insistence on what he calls the genocide of reformism. And I know that you heard from Sunera Tobani on liberalism. 2 new books have come out exploring liberal racism with respect to Muslims. Mitra Rastegar, Reading Media Discourses. Her book is How U.S. Liberalism Racialized Muslims. She argues that a good Muslim, bad Muslim binary secures white supremacy and secures the racial governance that Barna has named as racism's double bind. There are limits to tolerance. This argument resonates with critical race scholars such as Denise da Silva, who argues in The Global Idea of Race about the universal as constituted by its exclusions. There's a new book by media scholar Evelyn El-Sultani, Broken, The Failed Promise of Muslim Inclusion. The first contribution of this book is its recognition that anti-Muslim racism really circulates through institutions like an affect, the same argument I make, but that the limits of liberal inclusion are especially visible at moments framed as crisis. In the US, for example, the Muslim travel ban. Just when you think that Muslims have entered the doorway into humanity, you see that the inclusive move is itself how Muslim subpersonhood is secured. This makes the case for abolition as we contemplate the limits of a logic of reform and inclusion. The dangers of partial inclusion are really evident, for example, when you consider hate crime, where violence against Muslims is acknowledged, but only as an exceptional moment of hate, rather than the outcome of a structure of subpersonhood. So what I hope to do in the book is to shine a spotlight on both extremist and liberal whiteness by focusing on the emotions of white worlds and how they coalesce into a politics. I hope that readers will see how white supremacy is powered by a set of feelings and how whiteness is a condition which the law incubates. I haven't spared much time in this talk for anti-Muslim racism as a global phenomenon. We know, of course, that the making of the European as superior has always been a global project. Imperialism and colonialism show us this. But how do these long-established global tracks operate today in both the North and the South? I end my book with a very brief discussion of India and China, for example, both places devoted to the persecution of Muslims and as part of a territorial bid, but also as key to the making of a supremacist national subject. In the case of India, a Hindu supremacist national subject. In the case of China, a Han-Chinese ones. For such projects, it is essential to craft a racial line with Muslims as subhumanity. It is useful to position oneself as supremacist and to enlist the emotions that I've described, namely a national subject whose grievances can be channeled into a profound anti-Muslim animus. It's an important project to consider how whiteness may be applied to all of these contexts and how it may not. What are the limits? If we understand whiteness as an imperial category, where dominant groups announce themselves as racially superior and pursue their projects of accumulation as racial projects, then I think it will be very important for us to keep our eye on the figure of the Muslim. The Muslim, it turns out, remains the sort of phantom across the landscape without which supremacist projects cannot do without. So I'm going to leave it at that and hope we have time for questions.